So I found another distributor, got that installed, and it still had the issue. So I'm thinking, okay, it's the other side of the gears. And because the engine on this is a factory 360cc twin 2-stroke, so there's no cam. So typically in an engine, gasoline engine 4-stroke, they're running the distributor off a gear on the cam shaft. So this has no camshaft, so they're running the gear on the distributor straight off the crank. So there's a portion on the front of the crank that has spiral gearing on it, and that actually runs the distributor and the oil pump. The teeth on this were hammered. So Suzuki had a pretty strict regimen of greasing that particular area of the motor. It was isolated from the engine oil, and it needed a special Suzuki super grease, I think they call it, and you had to pack it in there every so many miles, and whoever had the vehicle just kind of hammered it, just like they hammered the splines on the drums. So that was totally shot. I got the engine running great. Unfortunately, anytime you got the revs up to a certain point or got a load on it, it would go 180 out. This was just heartbreaking to me because I knew how much the engine would cost to rebuild, and I was just like, oh man, I don't know what I'm gonna do. So I kind of shelved the project for a while and just kind of worked on my motorcycles. I bought a 4Runner.
What do you think, Dad?
And just kind of, was in other things. Then I decided, hey, you know what? Let's pull this engine out. Let's really get a good look at this engine. Maybe it's not as bad as I thought it would be. Got the engine out. Gonna try and fix this crank distributor gear problem. Pulling it out. Getting it on the bench. Just pulled it out in entirety. Didn't even drain the water or anything. But yeah, so now I'm gonna disassemble the whole thing and we'll see how she goes. Unfortunately, I underestimated how bad it was. Like I said, the oil pump and the distributor were both run off of this spiral gearing. And the whole time, I'm thinking pre-mixing the fuel was gonna be enough to lubricate the crankcase and everything would be fine. But unfortunately, this engine functions differently than most 2-strokes, where like a 2-stroke jet ski motor like this one, for example, has no crankcase oil. So everything is lubricated from the carburetors, from the oil in the gas, right? And this has an oil injection system, which the Suzuki did as well, and it worked fine. I pulled the pump. It was really grimy and gross, but it worked just fine, and the lines were clear, blew the lines out, everything was fine. But unfortunately, it was not driving. So as I'm pulling the engine apart, just for me running it a few times to get the engine running, the damage was intense. And I can't say it was me or if it was like that when I got it, but I mean, there was gouges in the pistons. The pistons had cracked skirts. There was gouging in the cylinder walls. But yeah, and there was more damage than that. The water pump cavities and the water jackets were full of growth and slime and debris, and it was just a mess, absolute mess. And when I pulled it apart, it was just heartbreaking. I'm like, all right, I'm basically gonna have to reinvent the wheel to rebuild this engine, and it's gonna cost me $5,000 at least, and it's gonna take me 2 years to source all the parts, and they're all gonna be used, so they're all gonna have to be machined. And so I just kind of said, all right, sayonara engine, put it up on the shelf. And I found a couple, an LJ10, the previous model to this, which was the same engine but air cooled. I found a guy in Ramona, which is a mountain kind of remote area of San Diego County, and he had 2 LJ10 engines and like 4 transmissions, and he was just selling them all for $200. So I loaded up my dog in the 4Runner. We went out there. So I'm out here buying some parts
And this guy has the wildest freaking driveway. Well, Ramona. And Duchess is getting nice and cozy with some parts. Aren't you, Dutch? You don't seem to mind.
And I ended up buying all that stuff and figured I could source the parts, but the engines were different, so I ended up selling those to a guy. And then I kept the transmissions because they're the same as the LJ20, so still got those as backups. Some of them were in rough shape, super rusted, but one of them was good, and I got an extra transfer case which was in really great condition, so I ended up replacing the one I had with that one. And so again, I shelved the project not knowing what I was going to do. I randomly was surfing Craigslist, and there was a guy up in Anza, which is a mountainous area kind of towards Temecula, like just outside of San Diego County, and he was selling a 1995 KTM 250 EGS, which is like a two-stroke kind of off-road model, kind of motocross model, not like a designated off-road, not designated motocross, kind of in between. I think it had a 5-speed wider medium ratio transmission, but no headlight or anything, kind of the motocross plastics, but with like an off-road gear ratio and probably an 18-inch rear wheel. Anyways, the bike had no wheels, no title, nothing, was missing the stator and the magneto, and he was selling it for $350. So I was like, all right, let's just go buy this thing, at least check it out, because it was right next to a track called Cahuilla Creek that I was going up to ride that weekend. So I went up there, and it was snowing. It was actually a really fun ordeal. The guy was a total tweaker. He lived in a gas station that was closed. I was actually kind of jealous because it was a pretty cool shop. Like, he was a super tweaker though. But yeah, I would love to have that place. But anyways, he had this whole little motorcycle shop set up in an old gas station. And so I ended up buying that from him, put it on the hitch hauler with no wheels, but it had forks, it had rear shock, radiators, basically everything but the wheels. And so I was like, all right, I can at least sell all these other parts, you know, and if not, get some wheels, maybe get it going, make a little money off this project. So anyways, I came back to my shop, I got it on the stand, took everything apart, had a guy that wanted the forks right away, so I said, all right, let's just part this out. So I ended up parting it out. I still have a few of the parts, still have the rear shock, still have the radiators, and basically started to assess the engine, and it was just like brand new. I popped the cap off the head, and it just still had cross hatching, and I'm just like, what happened to this bike? Like, somebody rode it, crashed it, took off the magneto and the stator. Like, the crank was kind of damaged, so I think they crashed it on the stator side, messed up the crank, thought it was totally shot, sold the magneto, sold the stator, and then basically left it sitting because the bike was just haggard. They had painted it with house paint, I think, because they didn't like the color, and so the plastics I just ended up throwing away. But anyway, so I had that chilling. Then I decided, hey, you know what? Why don't you try and put that engine in the Suzuki? You've got it sitting here. It's kickstart only. What are you going to do there? I don't know. Let's just kind of play it by ear and figure it out as we go along. So I repaired the engine.
Feels pretty good. I like that.
Bought some parts for it off of eBay, and found some pretty cool sources for parts on eBay in that search process. And then I got the engine running, and I took the frame and I cut it so it was just basically the bottom cradle. And then I took the cross member for the factory engine of the Suzuki, which was already damaged and re-welded with some angle. It was pretty shoddy work that I wanted to repair anyways. So I was like, I'll just weld this to that and put the engine in there and then figure out a drive shaft. So I got the engine situated, and then I was like, okay, the pipe doesn't fit, so I got to figure that out later. And then with the engines and pieces that I bought for the LJ10, I had extra universal joints. I had I didn't have an extra drive shaft, but I had like 4 extra universal joints with the axles on them that were that had splines, and I had the matching ends. So I was like, I can kind of make a drive shaft out of this. And so essentially what I did was get the engine situated as far to the center as I could to align the output shaft with the transfer case. From there, I basically took a drive shaft, figured out kind of the approximate length it needed to be, tacked it into place, got the sprocket from the output shaft of the dirt bike engine and welded it to the universal joint. So basically, which they're not very deep, so I've only got like an inch of splines engaging, so it's very sketchy. And so I put that on there, and then I approximated my length for my drive shaft, and then I welded it all down. And then I had a little bit of play in the engine so that I could get it on, and then squeeze the engine, squeeze the shaft in, not too tight, just enough to have it so it moves freely, and then bolt the engine down, and then my shaft was in place. So then I had to figure out how I was going to shift the thing. So, and at this point I still have no idea how I'm going to start it, right? I kind of have these ideas in my head. I'm going to pull off the Kickstarter and put a big rod on it so I can do it with my hand. A bunch of stuff's kind of flying through my head. I'm just kind of putting a few hours a day on this after work, just kind of having fun with it. So anyways, I'm like, okay, how do I shift it? So I figured, well, I'll take the shift lever off, and then I'll fabricate something with another shift lever so it goes straight to the shaft, and I can shift it that way. But it turns out that the lever made the shifting better because the lever increases the circumference of the shift action. So when I shortened that action, it would double shift, and it was really hard to feel where the shifting was happening. So basically what I did was put the lever back on, and then I said, all right, I need to figure out a way to linkage the lever. So I went to Good Guy's Car Show, and they have a guy that has just a bunch of tools, and he has all these crazy extensions and universals and all this. And I was like, well, why don't I just use 3/8 ratchet stuff, and I'll make a shifting unit. And then, because this was never meant to be long term, so I'm like, all right, I'll just use this, and then it'll save me a lot of time in fabrication. I can use the different extensions to make it as long as I need to. I can use a ratchet on the end. So I got a couple Heim joints. I got some long extensions, drilled a hole in the firewall. I took an old ratchet, like a piece of junk Chinese one, popped the head out of it, used that as an eyelet. I put that over the end of the shift lever that you're supposed to shift with your foot, that's on the motorcycle engine. And then I took a socket, drilled a hole in that, put that lever through that, and then clamped it on both sides. That socket was connected to a ratchet extension that I ran through Heim joints that I randomly placed on both sides of the firewall and bracketed them in place in line so it would hold the shift shaft, which was essentially a 2.5 foot 3/8 ratchet extension. Ran that through the firewall. Then I took another ratchet I got the swap meet that was broken with a big handle on it, and I took that apart. I found a 3/8 hand ratchet for really tight confined spaces, and I welded that inside of the ratchet housing essentially, and it was a big 1/2 inch ratchet and it had nice feel to it. So I was like, that'll work, that'll give me enough leverage. And so I put it right in the shifting spot, and I shift right to left. Dirt bikes are down is first, and then up is, second, third, fourth, fifth. So I go down into first, then a 1/2 click up is neutral, and then I'd go all the way up into fifth, and I could find neutral every time. I could shift through it every time. I was really amazed that it worked so well. And so I was like, all right, this is great, I'll just leave that. And so then I had to make the exhaust work, which meant flipping the header completely upside down, but then I still had to cut away the fender well in order to clear it. I hadn't reclocked the exhaust at that time, so the exhaust was sticking straight up, but I didn't have the front hood on, so I didn't really need to worry about that yet. And so basically what I did was, I was like, all right, well, I got to route this exhaust, otherwise it's just going to shoot straight up, straight out of the header. I'm like, I need to put on a muffler. So for the first test run, I just put the muffler straight on it, so it's sticking way up, and then I had a support going to the windshield, one of the bolts on the windshield. And it looks pretty funny, but at this point I didn't know if it was going to work, right? So I just kind of mounted the exhaust on there. I was like, all right, well, now I've got the shifter. I used the throttle linkage, hooked it to the foot pedal, used the clutch linkage, hooked it to the foot pedal. Feel was good, pull was fine, everything seemed to be working fine. I was kind of amazed that everything was working. And then I got a radiator from a Banshee, from a Yamaha Banshee. I put that in there. And so then starting was the problem. So I'm sitting there, I made a rod to start it with, and I pulled off the kickstart foot lever, put that on there, and I'm trying to start it, and it's just not starting. And I'm just kind of like, all right, what am I doing wrong here? Well, my whole thinking was backwards. So I had a lever that was longer, but the action to start an engine is short and stabby. So when you put on a longer lever, you're making the action longer and slower. And so I was like, okay, this isn't going to work. And I'm just going basically, all right, I just wasted all this time for nothing. I don't know what I'm going to do. So I kind of put it on the shelf again. So then a few days or a week went by, and all of a sudden I had the idea, like I was in the shower or just woke up or something, and I'm like, hey, well, why don't I cut the kickstart lever, the foot lever, I'll cut it, I'll run a bolt through it, I'll attach a chain to the bolt that drops down below the engine. Then what I'll do is I'll make a rod with a hook on the end, about this long, so I can get underneath the engine, hook it on the chain, and then I'll kick that rod down. So what I ended up doing was making a T-shaped rod, so the T would keep the rod square on the ground, and I put grip tape on it, and I put a little chain hook on the end. And so all it did was essentially do a chain extension on the Kickstarter. So then all of a sudden I can start it, but I have to start it from the front of the vehicle. And two strokes, when you start them, you have to be on the throttle. So how can I be in the car on the throttle while I'm starting it from the outside? So
Oh God.
not neutral. I can't believe it works really, really good. I can't believe it.